Welcome to another operations research video. This one is a kind of fun example of meta-heuristics, specifically looking at genetic algorithms applied to solving Sudoku puzzles. So uh, let's go, let's get started. So just to start off with the takeaways, this is going to be a little bit more of a fun lecture. Um, this is actually a lecture that I prepared several years ago, back when I was in grad school. But I think it works well in this context as well. But so kind of what I want you to get out of this is explore math ideas beyond the confines of the classroom. Ask questions that interest you, try things out. That's really where learning happens, and then share what you learn, both successes and failures. And so this is an example of something I did in grad school. I wanted to know more about genetic algorithms. I needed a problem to motivate me to learn about them. And so this is sort of the story of what I learned when applying genetic algorithms to Sudoku. So, uh, kind of the story of the motivation started off with a gift from my brother-in-law for Christmas. He gave me this kind of poster wall hanging Sudoku puzzle. Supposedly, it's the hardest one. After a couple hours of frustration and sticky notes covering it, I had made really no progress on it. At the same time, I also had a curiosity about genetic algorithms. I was also sort of looking for something to procrastinate on, to distract me from my thesis. And so this was a good project, a side project while I was in grad school. So a little bit about Sudoku. Originally introduced in 1984 in the US as number place by Howard Garns. It then went to Japan, became popular there, and got the name Sudoku, meaning the digits must be single, and then kind of came back to the US in the early 2000s and is now very, very popular. So the rules of Sudoku is that the goal is to fill in all the empty squares with the digits 1 through 9, such that every row has each digit exactly once, every column has each digit exactly once, and every block contains each digit exactly once. Um, so that's sort of, here's a picture of an empty puzzle that you start off with, and then the goal is to fill it in like the puzzle on the right with values that make these three rules true. So some terms that I'll use in regarding Sudoku, as well as kind of how I'm solving Sudoku, is rows, columns, blocks, and givens. So rows are the horizontal rows, columns are the vertical columns. Blocks are these 3 by 3 blocks, where you also need the digits 1 through 9 in each of the 3 by 3 blocks. Givens are the values that you're given at the beginning of the puzzle, and so those are already filled in, as opposed to the empties that you're trying to fill in. And then permutation is a mathematical term, but it will come up a lot in that if we look at the numbers 1, 2, 4, 7, a permutation of that set is just a reordering of it. And that comes into play of the digits 1, 2, 4, 7 are exactly the digits that are missing from this top left block. And there are 4 factorial different permutations of those numbers. And so there's essentially 4 factorial different ways we can fill in this top left block with those missing numbers. So kind of 24 different ways to fill in just that one block. And then if you think of there's 5 empty spots here, there'd be 5 factorial, which is 120 different ways to fill in this block, and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about how you can solve Sudoku. There's a lot of different strategies. I mean, like, it is a puzzle, and so the typical way to do it is pencil paper and kind of and that way. But let's think computationally, and one way you can solve it is as a linear binary program, and one way to encode it is to create decision variables that are binary variables that are 0 or 1, and they're 1 if row R column C is value V. And so you'd have one decision variable, for example, 3, 3, 7. If row 3, column 3 had a 7 in it, that value would be a 1. Otherwise, it'd be 0. That gives you There's 9 rows, 9 columns, and 9 different values. And so there's 9 times 9 times 9, or 729 different variables, binary variables in there. And then as far as constraints, you get constraints for the rows. You get 81 constraints for the rows. You get 81 constraints for the columns. You get 81 constraints for the blocks. And you also get 81 constraints that enforce that each cell only gets one number. Otherwise, you'd have sort of the possibility of trying to shove more than one number into a single cell. And so there's 81 times 4 different constraints, or 324 constraints all told. Now, and that's before you consider the givens that are given to you at the beginning of the puzzle. There's 2 ways to kind of think about doing those givens. You could add an additional constraint for each given that sort of locks in the correct value that's given by that number. Or, and that will add constraints, and in general, that means you're making the problem more complicated. Or you can actually sort of smartly remove constraints based off of the given, sort of what you do logically. If you were filling out the puzzle, like once you know a given, you sort of remove all the other variables in that row for that number, right? So if you've got a 5 in the first row that's a given, you can essentially remove all the variables corresponding to a 5 in the first row in different cells. And so if you do it that way, you actually can get the example problem that I showed you down to just 254 variables and 240 constraints, because there's also sort of some other variables that are forced in. Yeah, so it makes the problem much smaller and run much faster. And so it actually runs pretty fast as long as you use the second method, but very slow if you use this first method of just adding more constraints. Interesting to think, what's the objective function if this is a linear binary program? Well, for Sudoku, we're just interested in finding a solution that's feasible, meets the constraints. We really don't care about the objective. You can use it whatever objective you want. It doesn't really matter. And so you can actually just use no objective and kind of have the objective function just be the 0 function and just look for feasible solutions. Okay, here's another way you can solve Sudoku with kind of logic. And so this is actually a professor from St. Olaf, Bob Hansen. He's a chemistry professor there, but he coded up this interesting Sudoku solver that uses different methods of logic to solve it. And what's interesting here is I put in the puzzle that my brother-in-law gave me, and you'll notice it came back as stuck. So not only was the problem that he gave me hard for humans to do, it's hard for kind of human logic encoded to do, and it got stuck in this kind of logic-based solver. So it wasn't just me that was having a hard time with it. Another strategy would be backtracking, essentially kind of a brute force algorithm where you successively try to fill in the empties with different values. It's guaranteed to find a solution, but it might take a while. There's this nice animated GIF playing in the background of the example on this puzzle here of kind of row-wise backtracking. Another flavor of backtracking is an algorithm called dancing links. That is a very, very, very efficient solution method for Sudoku problems. And actually, it's probably the way to solve Sudoku problems. And that's an algorithm introduced by Donald Knuth. And yeah, it's really cool. I encourage you go look it up. It's kind of not directly related with this video, so I won't talk about it anymore. And then the last possibility would be stochastic searches, which we're going to focus on. Oh yeah, so let's talk a little bit how big the search space is, maybe in the context of backtracking. If we're naively trying to fill in the empties, there's 9 options for each empty, and we'd have essentially 9 raised to the number of empties in the puzzle. So for this puzzle, there's 9 raised to the 51 different possibilities, which gives us a ridiculously big search space. And so if we were to kind of implement something that naively tried each of the numbers 1 through 9 in all the empty cells here, that would give us a problem that would really just never end. Okay. 10 to the 48th is a huge number. But if we're a little bit smart, we can kind of implement only look at kind of we can choose one of the constraints to satisfy automatically and just look at permutations of those. And so we could kind of do things block-wise, row-wise, or column-wise, and that gets the number of kind of different permutations down to just 10 to the 23rd, which is still a very big number. If you do row-wise backtracking, though, because you stop checking any further solutions once you run into a problem, you could actually get it done in just about 40,000 checks, which is not too bad. Okay, and it runs in under a second for this problem. Now, that said, you can design Sudoku puzzles that are specifically designed to be hard for row-wise backtracking. And so this is an example puzzle. It has the minimum number of given clues that's possible and still having a unique solution to that puzzle. And the top row of the actual solution goes in reverse order, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And so that's the sort of the last thing that you'd check if you were doing sort of row-wise backtracking. And I did implement a quick kind of program that does row-wise backtracking, and it took 600 million checks for this one compared to under 40,000 for the other one. And it took about 20 minutes for this to run versus under a second. So let's get into genetic algorithms, which is going to be the focus of this video. And so I sort of talked about all the other ways to solve Sudoku. Let's talk a little bit about genetic algorithms. So they are a stochastic optimization algorithm. The stochastic part means that randomness is involved. And we'll show you kind of how randomness is used. It's inspired by biology. A lot of people in computer science like to have some sort of connection with the way the natural world works in informing how their algorithms should work. And the two parts of biology that kind of show up in genetic algorithms is genetic reproduction of this idea of crossover and mutations that is taken from genes, and how genes cross over and mutate in successive generations. As well as the idea of natural selection, in that there's sort of an element of the fittest or the strongest survive in genetic algorithms. Another key concept of genetic algorithms is that there's building blocks that form your solution, and that these building blocks, if you kind of combine good building blocks, you get good solutions. And an overall thing to keep in mind with genetic algorithms, as well as all other kind of meta heuristics like genetic algorithms, is that they're useful when you're looking for good solutions to an optimization problem, but they're not guaranteed to get you the best. Okay. But when you have a problem that sort of is non-convex or very hard, oftentimes good is good enough. And that's what you want to go for. In the context of Sudoku, you really want the exact solution, so good really isn't good enough. And so maybe genetic algorithm's not the best choice for Sudoku, but it was a useful kind of fun problem to play with and to learn about genetic algorithms. So also I'll say there's many variations on genetic algorithms and choices that you can make on how to implement genetic algorithms, and there's this balance that you can play with between exploration and exploitation, which we'll get to a little bit later on. So how can we represent a puzzle in terms of genes? We need to represent any candidate solution, and a candidate solution is just a filling in of the blank spots in our puzzle. And we needed to do it in a way that works with genetic algorithms. So in general, for genetic algorithms, we can represent our solutions as binary arrays, real valued arrays, integer valued arrays. There's even kind of variations that work on trees, which are kind of, less structured arrays, I'd say, for that. For our Sudoku, we'll use a 2x2 or two-dimensional array of the integers 1 to 9. okay? And really we'll lock down all the givens and then really only be looking at the empties in each of the cells. Okay, this is the overarching pseudocode for genetic algorithm, is that you initialize a population, you evaluate how good each candidate is, and then you go into a loop where you select parents, you mate or cross over those parents to create offspring, you mutate the offspring, you evaluate how well the candidates solutions do those off for the offspring, and then you select which individuals are going to survive to the next generation, and then you repeat for another generation. And so it kind of mimics a population of animals where there's mating to create offspring. Some of those offspring survive, some succumb to the elements, and kind of fittest survive, and then the next generation reproduces. And the idea is that kind of by having this fittest survive sort of thing, you should end up with a population or a whole bunch of good solutions. Okay. So, and you keep going until you decide to stop. And there's a couple of different ways you can decide to stop. But I'll kind of walk through each of these steps now and kind of go more in depth on each of them. So, initialization, we want to have a random and diverse population to begin with. And so for Sudoku, I chose to kind of keep the blocks together. Okay, and so I'm going to always satisfy the block constraints. And so then it makes it much easier to just check row and column constraints. And so to create a candidate solution, I fill in each of the blocks with one of the possible permutations of the missing digits. Okay, and so this is that top left block, and we said that it's missing 1, 2, 4, and 7. And so this is one way to fill in that block. Here's another way to fill in that block. And so essentially I did random fill-ins of each of the blocks and then assembled those blocks into the entire puzzle. So, and built a bunch of different puzzles to make our initial population. And so that's one of the choices, is how large of a population do you want? Do you want 100? Do you want 1,000 in your population? But once you have your population, you need to evaluate how good is each solution. So how good is called fitness. And genetic algorithms and optimization algorithm. So we need to have this is going to be the objective function that we're trying to maximize or minimize. In this case, we're going to try to minimize this fitness. And the fitness is the number of repetitions in each row or each column. And so in this top row here, in this puzzle, there's 2 2s. And so that's 1 repetition. In the second row, there's 2 4s. So that's another repetition. Here there's 2 5s as well as 2 7s. And so there's 4 different rows here that have a repetition in them. And so this puzzle gets a fitness score of 4. Okay. The more repetitions, the sort of worse the puzzle is, right? The perfect puzzle, the exact solution, has a fitness of 0 because there should be no repetitions in any rows or any columns. Additionally, I said anything that conflicts with a given is like a really bad thing. And so I've made it 100 times as bad to repeat a digit that's a given digit, because you know from the beginning that shouldn't happen. And so, for example, if you were to have another 5 in the top row with this given 5, that would give you a penalty of 100. Okay. So once you've evaluated your candidates, then you're ready to go into this cycle of kind of generations of your puzzles. So first thing to do is select parents. These are going to select which puzzles are going to combine to create new puzzles. Various ways you can be inspired by nature on how this works. You can kind of use some natural selection forces to select the parents. You want to select 2 or more. In the case of Sudoku puzzles, you can kind of combine up to 9 different puzzles and take blocks from each of them in order to create your offspring block blocks. Couple different methods you could use to select them. You could kind of just randomly choose two puzzles from the population to cross over. You could do a tournament selection where you kind of select maybe two puzzles here and have them compete. Whichever has the better fitness then goes on to reproduce. And the same for another one. This would be maybe like something like how there's competition in nature over which male gets to mate. There's sort of fitness proportionate uh, selection where you use some other sort of rule where um, puzzles with better fitness are more likely to reproduce. Maybe somewhat inspired by kind of peacocks showing off for other peacocks in order to find the mate. Um, and then there's a whole bunch of other different ways. Um, yeah, and so for our Sudoku problem, I use tournament selection with two individuals and lowest fitness wins. And so for each of the two parents, I chose two puzzles, so four puzzles total. I had them compete against each other, and then the better of the two puzzles was the one that reproduced. So once you select parents, then you need to cross over the parents to create the new offspring. In this case, what I did for the crossover is I selected some of the blocks from the first parent and some of the blocks from the second parent, and then combine those to create the child. And so this child puzzle gets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the blocks from parent one, and then all the ones that I've circled it or kind of outlined in blue come from parent two. Okay. And we preserve the fact that we're still going to always be satisfying the block constraints, but this should jumble up sort of which of the row constraints we're still satisfying, because you'll notice in a given row, some of the values are coming from one parent and some are from another. Same with the columns. There's going to be some jumbling up and hopefully finding patterns that work better. So once you've crossed over the parents, then the next step is to introduce some mutations in there. And that if we only crossed over the parents, we'd be left with just the combinations that were in the initial population. And if our optimal solution isn't among those possibilities, then we're not going to find the optimal solution. And so we want to introduce some extra randomness here by mutating the offspring. And so in the context of Sudoku puzzles, we can do that mutation by randomly swapping two cells within a block. Okay, so that we're still preserving our block constraints. We'll just randomly swap two within a cell. And I did it so that there was a 1/100th chance of any cell being swapped after we did the crossover. Okay. Once we've mutated, then we evaluate those new candidates, essentially measure their fitness score again. And once we've measured their fitness score, we're ready to select the individuals for the next generation. Okay, and this is where sort of you have some element of survival of the fittest on how you select going into the next generation. Now, there is a trade-off. If you only choose the best to survive, you'll very quickly have a population of puzzles that are identical to each other, and then you have no kind of genetic variation, and you're not going to actually search the search space well to find the optimal solution. You'll just be stuck at what we'd call a local minimum. So there's always this trade-off between exploration, kind of exploring the different kind of possibilities, and then exploitation is sort of taking advantage of the best parts of the best solutions to hopefully find better solutions. So I've got a couple different selection schemes that I investigated when I was doing this. Elitism chooses the best candidates from the previous generation to survive, and then the rest are just the offspring. Niching kind of clusters the populations and into subpopulations and selects the best from similar ones. Same sort of idea with crowding, but there you're kind of competing against the most similar candidate in the population. And then you can also do other diversity-based selection where you sort of select the best individual and then you select the next best individual that is at least a certain distance away from the ones that are already selected. But all of these sort of bring up the question of similarity, right? For niching, crowding, and diversity based, we need some way to measure how similar two puzzles are to each other. And so that brings up this question of distance. And so we can use what's called Hamming distance to measure the distance between two puzzles. And the Hamming distance is just the number of spots where the two puzzles are different from each other. And so these two puzzles are almost identical, except for this puzzle has this 2 and 4 swapped and this 4 and 5 swapped. And so these two puzzles have a Hamming distance of 4 away from each other. Okay, and so as far as anytime, if you were to just swap two blocks in general, you'll increase the Hamming distance by 2. Yeah, and so when we're talking about similarity or how close puzzles are to each other, this is the distance that we're thinking about. And then you kind of repeat the generations until you come to the end. And how you might choose to terminate, you could find the optimal solution. Sometimes you know ahead of time what the optimal solution looks like. In Sudoku, you know that the optimal solution has fitness of 0. And so if you ever get to fitness of 0, you can just stop. Otherwise, usually you stop after a certain number of generations or fitness evaluations or a certain amount of run time, or when you haven't seen any improvement, or when there's a lack of diversity. So I'll show you some examples of some of the different code that I ran, and you'll find that a lot of them very quickly get to where all the individuals in the population are identical to each other. And then you're really not doing anything and you're just spinning your wheels as far as genetic algorithms go. So some other variations that can be useful in genetic algorithms is reinitialization, which is where you periodically kill off a portion of the population and start over, maybe preserving some of the best candidates from before. Because especially if your algorithm sort of gets stuck with all the individuals that are identical, then you sort of want to get rid of all the identical copies and just restart. And then another powerful technique is what's called local search. Sometimes it's called mimetic algorithms when combined with genetic algorithms, where you check neighboring solutions of a candidate to see if there's a nearby neighbor that's better. And you can do this at different points in the algorithm, but usually after maybe selecting your next generation, then you kind of look for nearby solutions. So there's this trade-off between exploration, where you want to maintain a diverse population so that the whole search space is covered, and exploitation, where you're taking advantage of the building blocks of good solutions to find better solution. And depending on the problem, more or less exploration might be needed. And I'll kind of point some of that out. So once I'd sort of set this up, I decided I wanted to test it out. I tested it out with 7 different Sudoku puzzles. They're kind of ordered from easy to hard. The easiest one was the one that I found on Wikipedia that I've sort of been using as an example throughout. Puzzle 6 was the puzzle that my brother-in-law gave me with 21 givens. Puzzle 7 was the row-wise backtracking one that only has 17 givens. So I tested 5 different methods, 30 trials per puzzle. I set the population to be 100 for each of these, and then I used 2,000 generations until I just stopped it after 2,000 generations if it hadn't found an optimal solution. So here are the 5 methods that I test. This was mostly for how I did the offspring selection, or who survived to the next generation. The first one would be replace worst, where I kept the best top certain number of individuals from the previous generation. and then the rest are the offspring. Elitist, I sort of kept just the one best from the previous generation. Sawtooth is kind of cool where you have a variable population size and you sort of start off with a large population and then narrow it down and then reinitialize with another population. And so large population. And so every 50 generations, it sort of reset. And so it went from twice as large a population as everybody else down to just a single one individual after 50 generations and then uh, went back up to 100 or 200, I think, actually. And so kind of goes up and down to sort of introduce new genetic material every time you restart it. Crowding and niching are both sort of diversity-based ones that kind of encourage the population to retain a bunch of diverse solutions. So here's maybe some examples. So replace worst with n equals 5. You take essentially your previous generation and your offspring, and you select the 5 best. And or kind of you another way to think of it is the 2 worst, this 9 and 10 from the previous generation, got replaced by the 2 best from the next generation. Elitist, you just choose 1 from the previous generation. Okay. And then all the rest, you just take all the offspring, no matter how good or bad they are. Sawtooth, you start off with a reasonable size. I think you just are keeping 1 from the previous generation, but then you're eventually getting down to where you only have 1 in the previous generation and you generate a whole bunch of new random offspring when you reinitialize. Okay. Crowding, you look for sort of similar solutions. And so here I'm using kind of color to represent similarity. And so amongst the green ones, the best of those was this 4. And so it's going to go there. And then the 2 was the best of the orange ones. The 5 was the best of the yellow, and the blue was 9 was the best of the blue. So essentially of solutions that are similar to each other, you chose the best. For niching, you sort of start off by choosing the very best and then eliminating from consideration any solutions that are similar to that solution. And then you choose the next best and eliminate any other similar solutions. And then the next best, each time eliminating any similar solutions. Okay. So a lot of different techniques, and they kind of go from being more exploitive to more explorative at the bottom of the graph. And here for the 7 different puzzles, and maybe I'll move my face out of the way a little bit. What you'll notice is the first one, first method had a very low solve percentage in that it only solved the first puzzle 26% of the time and didn't solve any of the other puzzles. So not very good. The elitist method worked well on the first puzzle, but not very good on the rest. Sawtooth did okay on the first puzzle, but not very good on any of the rest. Crowding actually did pretty good on the first puzzle, but also not very good at any of the rest. The niching actually solved the first puzzle 100% of the time, and then actually solved puzzles 2 and 3 and 4 some of the time. But I'll also point out this last column here is how long did it take to fail? And that one took the longest to fail, and that it just took a lot longer just to run because of some of the extra computations it was doing. Next thing I did is added local search. So I'd have it sort of search nearby solutions at each step when generating new solutions. And there you see now all of the methods solve the first puzzle. The second puzzle gets solved by sawtooth, crowding, and niching at least pretty often. And we'll just look at the bottom here. Niching always solves the first puzzle, always solves the second puzzle, most of the time solves the third puzzle. a good sum of the time solves puzzles 3, 4, and 5, and at least sometimes solves puzzles 5, 6, and 7. Okay. But what I will point out is when these failed, they took a lot more time. So taking 40 to 80 seconds to fail versus 150 to 250 seconds to fail. Adding that local search is much more likely to get you to a solution, but it's also going to take longer because it's extra computation in there. And then to kind of put genetic algorithms in context, here I've added row-wise backtracking. It always solved it, but took kind of less than a second for puzzles 1 through 6, and then the 20 minutes for puzzle 7. And then if I go to dancing links, the Donald Knuth algorithm, it solved all of them, and it took less than a millisecond to solve any of them. And so if you really want to solve Sudoku puzzles, don't use genetic algorithms. Use the dancing links algorithm. It's going to be very efficient to solve it. But if you want to learn about genetic algorithms, Sudoku is an interesting puzzle. Here are maybe some graphs to illustrate maybe what was going on over the generations as the puzzles were solving. And so this was for puzzle 6, one of the harder puzzles. Here's the best fitness. And so you'll notice they all start off with pretty bad fitness, but as the generations go on, it gets lower, but it sort of plateaus here where it's got a fitness of 2, essentially, meaning that very quickly all of these get to the point where they have at least one solution that's just 2 cells swapped, or has just 2 conflicts in it. Okay, just 2 conflicts, but it can't resolve that last set of conflicts. Here's sort of the average fitness of the puzzle. And so this yellow here is the sawtooth, and you'll see that it has a spikes every 50 generations where it's sort of resetting the population, and that kind of makes it on average worse, but it also introduces a bunch of diversity in there. This red one is niching. It kind of, on average, doesn't do well, but that's because it's sort of preserving some variability, some diversity. Here's, I think the crowding is this one. The replace worse and the elitism are these 2 down here. They very quickly get to an average, well, the replace worse very quickly gets to an average fitness of 2. And the reason why is because all the solutions are identical and that they get to that best solution that has a fitness of 2 with just 2 conflicts. This is interesting. So I know what the exact solution to that puzzle is. I can look at the distance between the best solution from the genetic algorithm and the exact solution. And this is actually very interesting. So although I said they all got to the point where they had a fitness score of 2, meaning they only had 2 conflicts, all of those solutions were very far away from the exact solution. Okay, in that they were a distance of about 25 to 40 away from the exact solution. And so there were only 2 conflicts, but overall there were 40 cells that were not matching up with the exact solution. And that is kind of crazy to think about, especially when there are maybe only 50 empty cells that you could fill in. And so even the best solutions were different in about, so some of these where it was getting down to 25, even the best solutions were different from the exact solution in half the cells. Is kind of crazy. Average distance to the exact solution is another way, just kind of looking how far the population is from the exact solution, and it tends to be pretty far. Entropy, this is an interesting measure that measures how diverse the population is. You'll notice replace worst has no diversity because all the solutions end up being the same solution. The sawtooth is this one going up and down in the background. It adds a bunch of diversity every time it reinitializes. And then as the population gets smaller, it loses its diversity. These two, crowding and niching, both sort of preserve more diversity throughout, which allows them to have to search more of the search space and hopefully find the optimal solution. Okay, so that's a wrap up of Sudoku and genetic algorithms. Hopefully gave you a flavor of how genetic algorithms work. And maybe what are some of the choices as you're designing a genetic algorithm for a specific application. Here are some extra resources. I'd say the Segura paper was one of the ones that sort of inspired what I did, and he wrote the importance of diversity and application of evolutionary algorithms to the Sudoku problem. And so some of the things that I tried out were suggested by him. Here's a link to the dancing links algorithm. Interesting paper. Here's the logic solving a Sudoku by the professor at St. Olaf. And then if you want a general reference on genetic algorithms, Iben and Smith is a pretty good textbook, essentially, on genetic algorithms. So some conclusions to wrap up. Genetic algorithms are useful for finding good solutions, but probably not the best algorithm for Sudoku. For hard probabilities, diversity is important for genetic algorithms so that they search the breadth of the search space. And then explore math ideas beyond the classroom. It's really powerful if you want to learn something to find an application. And if you start maybe from a paper like I did with the Segura paper and try to implement it yourself and see what other changes you can throw in there, that's a pretty good strategy. And then share what you learned. So I was able to give this talk a couple times when I was in grad school to some undergrad students. Now that I'm a professor, I've given the talk a couple more times in my operations research classes. And so it's a pretty good payoff for the time investment that I put in. So that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one.